Okay. So yeah, I've got a number of hats. I suppose I've got two hats really, and the hat I'm mainly using today is the hat of having the personal experience of having been involved in a community-led self-build project, which started actually quite a few years ago now, and that's mainly what I'll be talking to you about. But also the other hat that I wear is I work at Ecomotive, which is a social enterprise that supports self-build groups and other kinds of community-led housing. So here we are. This is a small selection of the people living at Ashley Vale, and we're a community self-build project based in Bristol. And before I go into that, I'm just wanted to show, because Colin
I think we lost Anna. Hopefully.
I'm going to keep talking. Okay. Can you hear? Am I back again now? Sorry, that's my internet dropping out. Okay. So yeah, Colin was just was talking about community-led housing. That's the bubble on the left, and that is a range of different models. And then you've also got affordable housing, which is mostly, say, council housing and housing associations, and a lot of community-led housing is also affordable. So you can see the overlap there. And then you've got
oh no. I think it's classic, isn't it? We had sort of 15 minutes of uninterrupted chat beforehand and we've lost her again. I might see if she's able to move inside. Sorry about this, folks.
I'm really sorry, I keep dropping out here. I think my internet's been fine so far, so let's just keep going. So yeah, I was saying that community-led self-build can either incorporate affordable housing or it can be all private. So the scheme I'm going to talk about today is in the non-affordable part of it, but there's a lot of overlaps, so just bear that in mind. So this is the site that we started out with in Bristol, and interestingly, and slightly unusually for community-led housing, this project started with a site coming up for sale, and then a group came together around that site. It's often more common for a group to come together and say, let's build houses, where should we do it? But that's the way this one happened. And it was a 2-acre brownfield site, fairly close into the centre of Bristol. And as you can see, it had a number of buildings on it, and it was concreted. It came up for sale, and the local people in the area said, oh, this site's coming up for sale. We could either let a regular developer come in and build their regular houses on it, or we could try to pull people together and do something different. And so that's what we decided to do, and we did it. So this project was instigated by people in the local area, primarily people who weren't in housing need themselves, but they wanted to create something that was positive for the area and create opportunities for others to come in. So we started off with this kind of energy of what's possible for this site, what can we do on it to create the greatest benefit, and we did some local consultation with the community. We came up with some aspirations. We wanted to improve the area, we wanted to give local people access to low-cost housing, and we wanted to use self-build because we saw it as a route of empowerment to give people skills, confidence, and the idea of building a community physically, and people getting to know each other through that process, and that kind of idea of self-reliance. So they were the kind of things that we had in mind, and also sustainability. So how do we make this happen? And it's quite complicated, and I guess, but to try and simplify it as much as possible. The local group, the local organisation was set up as a company limited by guarantee. That was a community group. Anyone in the area could become a member of that and help influence decisions. That community group was then in a position to negotiate with the landowner and and also to lobby against the planning application that had gone in from a developer. And so we were going through that process, and in parallel we were creating our own designs. So we had consultation with the local area, we drew up some plans, and we we got together a list of people who wanted to self-build. And one of the questions that Colin asked me to talk about was how did we, or who was able to join the scheme? And actually it was quite pragmatic. It was pretty much anyone who was interested and who was agreed to sign up that they were going to self-build and that they were going to build with ecological materials and within a certain time scale. So people would come forward, they'd put down a deposit. There were no particular criteria of, say, for example, whether you'd owned a home before, and we only advertised it locally. So a few people did come in from outside the area, but most people actually did live locally. So it was kind of a word of mouth campaign, I suppose. And the end of the day, we had a long waiting list and people dropped out, and we went through the whole waiting list. And at the end, someone came in at the last minute, and we had to take them to make the scheme work. So it kind of, it shows the value of having a long waiting list. And I think in particular regard to self-build, because there are so many kind of things that can come up when you're thinking of building your own house, relationships break down, etc. That if you are going to do a group build project, definitely have more people on the list than you think you're going to need. And at the end, it all came together within it was only just over a year from having the concept through to buying the site, using the money from 20 staff builders plus a housing association partner, and getting our planning permission. So it's pretty fast work. This is what the scheme looks like in overview. We divided it up into 20 self-build plots around the edge, and then there were 6 smaller plots on a kind of crescent shape in the middle, which that whole area was sold to Redland Housing Association to provide the affordable housing on the site. And that wasn't to be self-build. Excuse me a moment, there's a train going past. I'm sitting outside. And if you look towards, I don't think I've got a cursor to show you, but towards the kind of bottom left, there's a rectangle there, which is an old office building, which we wanted to keep and renovate into workspaces for the local community. So we went with that. We got the planning, we went for detailed planning permission actually, but then
Oh, that lasted a bit longer, but hopefully we'll get her back.
Oh, excuse me, another train going by.
So Anna, sorry, we lost you very briefly when you said you got to detailed planning permission. But it was fine before that. Oh, maybe lost her again. I wonder. Oh. Hello. So, I wonder if she can still hear. Can you hear us, Anna? Maybe not. Well, it's a good opportunity to start thinking about questions anyway, which I can see some people have, which is great. Thank you. Let's have a look. Yeah, I thought that might be worth Anna going into her house. Someone's just mentioned. Yeah, I'll ask her that when she manages to come back. Hopefully that's where she's going now. Oh, maybe we could get her to turn off her camera. Yeah, good suggestion. Sounds good.
Perhaps
In the meantime,
while we're waiting for Anna to come back, which hopefully she will, I think one of the interesting things that Anna raised at the beginning of her presentation was that self-built, community-led self-build projects can be both affordable and not classically affordable. And I think one of the interesting issues that the group identified, I took a group of students there 3 or 4 years ago, and we were discussing this. And one of the issues that they identified after they'd done the project, it didn't seem to be a problem when they started, was that they hadn't separated off the land element from the housing element. And so each of the self-build households own the freehold of the land underneath their house. And those houses might have cost them anywhere between £150,000 to £200,000 to build. And the current market value of those houses is probably around 600,000. So they've gone from being affordable houses, and they clearly were affordable for those people who built them in the first place, but they're not affordable in perpetuity. And one of the issues that any self-build group does need to be considering is whether they want those houses to be affordable in perpetuity. So I think this is something that we could perhaps revisit at the end when we come to questions. It's I think, a very important issue, really. Anna is back, but muted.
Yeah, I was just waiting. Sorry, I only just caught the end of what you were saying, Tim. Was you talking about affordability there?
Yes, I was just filling in time, and I was saying that that one of the interesting issues for groups, looking at doing a self-build project, is whether they consider it important to ensure affordability in perpetuity, and therefore whether it's necessary to, for example, separate off the land into a community land trust, or to do it in some other way. So I didn't want to divert you from your talk, but I thought I'd just fill in some space while you were gone.
Thank you. I mean, that's a really, I'd love to come back to that. I could say something briefly about it more, and I'm sure there's quite a lot I could say about it, but it'll come up in the questions. But what I would say is something that made the project, that was actually critical, I think, to the success of the project at Ashley Vale, was it happened very quickly because we weren't reliant on any kind of grant funding. We made the scheme work because people came forward and bought their plots. But what we didn't anticipate at the time was how much property prices would go up in between the year 2000 and now. So that's, if we'd anticipated that, we might have explored a bit more different models. Anyway, I'm just going to here we go. How are we doing on timing? Obviously, we're down on timing, Hannah. So what do you suggest?
How would another 15 minutes sound? Let's do that.
Yeah, well, I might, or perhaps even a touch less. Let's just see how I go. But I want to leave plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, no problem. That's fine. Sounds grand.
Well, I'm just going to whiz through a few pictures of what it looked like. And as I was saying, each person had bought their own plot freehold, so they basically had jurisdiction over 20 individual self-build projects, which is quite interesting because it meant that there was no overall kind of health and safety requirement for the whole site, which actually meant it was slightly chaotic and everyone was building at different times. I don't know if I'd recommend it. All the regulations may have tightened up now. This is about 20 years ago. So you might see things here that you probably wouldn't see on a building site now, i.e. Lack of safety equipment and things. But people helped each other out, mucking in when there was a big job to do, like pouring the foundations. And what was really interesting, if any of you ever form a project where you get to use a brownfield site, what's absolutely brilliant is if you don't have to dig up the concrete and you can build on top, which is what we did. I would so recommend it. You've got the cleanest building site, no groundworks. We even managed to borrow a forklift truck for a couple of years, and we used that for picking deliveries off, and you could move around on the site. and it was brilliant. So we built up off the concrete, as you can see on the right there, our foundations. That's my house there. Oh, I can't get it to change. Oh, I'm not sure if my PowerPoint's frozen now. It won't change slides. Excuse me a moment.
We're still figuring out this new world of only being able to see each other on screens. So
Okay. Can you see me? Can you see the screen now? I haven't shared it, have I? Okay.
No, not just yet.
It's driving me crazy. Right. Let's try one more time.
It does take a while to register. There's a bit of a lag. There we go.
Okay. So let's try again. Here we go. Here. Right. Okay. Ha! Okay. That's me building the kind of upper foundations. And it's my partner Jackson. We pretty much on our plot pretty much did all the work ourselves. Other people got timber frame suppliers in to build the frame, and then most people did a bit of work on the house, or quite a lot depending on their situation. We had a little production facility going on in the ground floor of one of the old buildings on the site, building our timber panels. We use timber stud frame. It's a very easy and amenable way of building for non-professionals. So we were advised to do that by various people who kind of knew a bit about self-build, and it worked really well. That's what the ground floor of our house looked like. And then even my mum got involved briefly. She never picked up a power tool in her life, probably never would again. And yeah, we got kind of timber. Everyone had to choose from a palette of sustainable materials, so timber cladding or lime render, for example. I think that helped us get planning, because the houses are quite eclectic on the site, but we had this palette of materials that people could choose from. That's more or less what our house looked like before the neighbours built around it. If you look at the build cost, if anyone knows anything about build costs, I mean, that's pretty cheap. Like if you self-build now, you wouldn't be able to build a house that cheaply. Materials costs have gone up a lot since then, plus I think standards have gone up a lot, so you probably have to use more technology, etc. But we did almost all the work ourselves, so I guess their sweat equity would be on top of that, lost earnings. It took us about 4 years, and we took turns in taking time off work, working part-time, etc. to get it done. Just a couple of the other houses on site. People lived on caravans on the site, which was nice. It created a really nice community feeling, so I kind of recommend that as the kind of part of the community building if you can. And people did quite amazing things, like the house on the right is actually, you can't quite see, but it's got a curved roof, so you could be, if you're doing the work yourself, you can be more experimental, because if you paid someone to build a roof like that, it would probably cost a lot more, but you can muck around with it. And this is how the road went in. Because we built on top of the concrete, we then had to raise up the whole surface of the site, so you could put the services underground, the kind of wherever it is, 2 or 3 feet. So we built upwards. That also worked really well. And then on to the second phase of the project. So there was 20 self-built plots around the edge. If you remember, there were 6 housing association plots in the middle. Something went wrong there, and the housing association actually went bust and couldn't do the development. The funding was withdrawn, and the housing association ended up offering their plots for sale on the open market. And because there was no grant funding available, the only thing we could do as a community group was buy it back off them at close to market price. So we couldn't deliver affordable housing on it anymore. So what we did was think, what's next best? The other houses were nearly finished, so what we didn't want to do is have another round of self-build where the place was going to be a construction site for the next 5 years. So the community group decided to build the shells of the houses and then sell them off privately to households to finish the homes internally themselves. So this was a self-finished model, and we kind of created it from scratch. It might have happened before, but we kind of made it up, I suppose. And that allowed people to save a chunk of money, maybe between kind of 10 and 30,000, depending on how much the work they did themselves and what materials they chose. And that worked really well, because then the outsides of the bungalows went up quickly. They looked uniform. People could choose the colours of their windows and doors, but they were all installed. Plus we installed renewables on there to make sure that people didn't kind of say, oh no, I ran out of money to put renewables on, because that was something that had come up with the self-build. So they look great, and we put ceiling roofs. We try to make them as ecological as possible. You can see also in the foreground there's a shared garden area, which is for the whole site, but each house has also got its own private gardens. And then the third phase of the project was the old office building, which we'd initially planned to renovate to provide low-cost workspace and community venue. We went through about 2 or 3 different business plans for that, none of which actually stacked up, because the cost of renovating the building was so much that we couldn't, and then plus all the kind of, you'd have to put a lift in, you'd have to put fire escapes and all the stuff you need for a public building, which meant that we couldn't then have afforded to rent those workspaces affordably. So we took a different tack. We got a few households interested who were up for helping create another self-finish housing project. If you look on the bottom left picture, an extra story went on top, timber glulam beams. So we added extra volume to the building. The top 3 floors are divided into 6 apartments, and the ground floor is retained for community use. So there are 3 work units in there and a community venue, which is very well used. And then each apartment owner then got a blank space in which to then build whatever they wanted. So the picture on the right there, you can see someone's got this whole kind of big volume, which they've then gone and divided up into individual rooms according to their needs. So it went, so spot the difference, this one is from there to there. And that's great, because any developer would have come in and just knocked that building down, but we really wanted to keep the embodied energy and improve on it. So and it's heated 100% renewably. And then the last part of the project, which I wanted to mention also, was the kind of, this isn't directly related to the self-build, but it's kind of related to the energy of like community DIY, which is that we also wanted to improve the surrounding area. So we used a small amount of the surplus generated from the development to create our own kind of home zone, which is like a rejig of the road surface to make it safer for pedestrians and cyclists. So we put in planters and changed the orientation of the parking, and it's much nicer now. So I created this morning thinking, how can I map out, because it was a bit complicated. So I don't know if anyone's going to be able to take this in, but let's just give it a go very briefly, because how would you go through the process? And Tim was just talking before about, well, could you set it up as a community land trust? And I mean, that we could have done that actually, but we didn't. But what how you start off as a community group, and how you somehow transfer ownership of a plot of land to different people to build their own homes. And we're doing some more of this thinking now around the next project of this community group, which I'll talk about at the end. So the community group is called Ashley Vale Action Group. At the top you can see them red, and that group was set up, it's an open membership organisation. We set up as a company limited by guarantee, which is the kind of most straightforward ownership model. And that group acted as the project instigator, the development coordinator, and also negotiating with the landlord the sale of the property. But the sale of the property mainly didn't go to AVAG. A chunk of it went to the Housing Association. 20 different chunks went to self-builders, and the remaining chunk went to some of the office building went to AVAG to develop, and AVAG didn't have to pay any of its own money for that. AVAG didn't actually have any of its own money, apart from the deposits from the self-builders and a couple of very small grants. But it was kind of gifted in that land transfer, the office building. Another chunk of the land went to the Minor Road Management Company, which was the company, kind of a shell company, if you like, set up that after the development was over, it would own the communal parts of the land. So the road and the communal garden that you saw in the picture. So all of these transactions happened in a single day. We saved a lot on stamp duty because we divided them up into single freehold plots rather than selling or keeping it all under one freehold. So we saved a lot on stamp duty, but it cost quite a lot more in legal fees. The solicitors did very well. But that all happened on one day. I have no idea how. It was very complicated. And then the self-builders, the money that self-builders had put in, and the Housing Association created enough money not only to pay for the site, but also to install the services, the road, and all that kind of infrastructure. So each self-builder roughly spent 35,000 for their plot, but that was a serviced plot and included getting the road and all the services up to the edge of the plot. So it was a pretty good deal. But we did sign up at risk because there wasn't planning permission when we'd first put our deposits down. So then if you look at the Housing Association in purple there, they then sold back to AVAG. So you can see AVAG popping up then in red, and AVAG then developed and sold on to 6 self-finishers. The self-builders were effectively individuals, but we did set up a co-op. If you see in the middle there, there's a self-build co-op, and that was more just so we could have a bank account and kind of collectively order materials and things, and we paid for a project manager out of that kind of thing. And that co-op dissolved at the end of the build process and transferred kind of into the function of the management company. And then the office building, AVAG did that in conjunction with 6 self-finished households. And at the end of the day, they then took on a kind of collective ownership model called Common Hold for that building. And then everyone who's an owner of a home on the site becomes a member of the management company in the yellow at the bottom there. So the bit shaded in yellow are the owners of the site. You see that whole kind of shaded area. I don't know if that helps clarify it, but hopefully these slides can be shared afterwards so you can peruse it in more detail. So a couple of questions I was asked to touch on were, what did we need help with? So specifically, I mean, actually, amazing, we didn't actually need that much help. Within our group, we happened to have some architects, people who worked in the highways department of the council, people who worked in parks, someone who was a retired water engineer. We had like people who are builders. We had like virtually all the skills that you'd need to do a project, and people kind of threw themselves into it with a lot of energy. So a lot of it was done on kind of volunteering and goodwill. We did get small grant funding pots for various things like the kind of initial feasibility study, to getting some advice on design of the homes and how building techniques. And we did need to get a project manager in for some of the build phase, although we probably could have managed quite a lot without them. That's partly because they're all individual self-builders. If it was a joint self-build project, you definitely need a project manager, site manager to do all that coordinating work. Some of the challenges were, for example, I think even within the group that first came together, you start off by having all these ideas, and then once things start becoming reality, you realise that everyone wants something slightly different, and so that can cause a bit of tension. Yeah, we worked through that. Then having the community group and bringing in self-builders brought up some challenges, because what we found is if the initial community group hasn't set the parameters tightly enough or clearly enough, that when people come in, they might want to do things differently. And if it's not set out, then you start getting conflict. Well, hang on a minute, I want to use this material. Well, you can't. Yes, but you never told us that when we signed up, etc. So setting the parameters clearly for when people come in, I would really recommend that. People who fail to complete, our next door neighbour has part finished his house and will in most likelihood never finish it. And it's been like that for over 15 years. That's easier to deal with if you've got a kind of collective ownership model, like a community group that's owning the freehold or community land trust or something. We don't have that. So who knows? There's pigeons living in it at the moment, so I guess it's providing housing. Of course, the building a housing association partner failed, so that was a big challenge, but we did overcome that. And the business model. So when things don't work out, it's being able to have the resilience to kind of go, okay, pick yourself up. Well, what can we do then? What resources have we got or can we access to help with that? And then, well, I kind of want to say what made it work, but I also I'm conscious of time, and there was one more thing I wanted to cover. So in general, the things that made it work were the fact that people had energy and enthusiasm and skills and were willing to put in the hard work, and there was that kind of passion. Overall, all those things and we were lucky to find the land, and that I think that we weren't dependent on grant funding actually helped us a lot to do something relatively innovative, because we could make our own decisions on things. So I'm just going to skip I could stop talking now, I could just show you 2 slides from another project, just which might sow the seeds for questions.
That's
So
a good idea. Let's do that.
So this is just an overview of what it looks like now. But I wanted just to mention Bridge Farm, because Ashley Vale Action Group went on to buy another site only about a mile down the road, which is a 3.5 acre small farm that's been, actually, it's right by the M32. You can see it's actually been like cut in half by the M32. And it's got some old buildings on it. And we're now developing on their ideas for a new sustainable and affordable housing and living project. So if anyone has any questions, we can use that as an example, because we're thinking through, it's very live, we're thinking through all these questions about how do you make it affordable and sustainable and community involved, and who's going to own it. So yeah, rich topic. Thank you.
Very rich, and actually, yeah, really appropriate, because we did, Bridge Farm was raised as an example last week. We started to talk about co-housing, particularly in, you know, it seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but probably more prevalent in urban areas, town areas, and someone asked, well, you know, how applicable are these models to rural areas? And particularly for us discussing in Wessex, obviously we do have some urban centres, but a lot of our current community housing projects are very much rural. So I suppose Bridge Farm kind of bridges that, if you will, that kind of rural, but also that urban, but also rural feel. So great, amazing. Thank you so much, Anna. I will have a look at the little question box and see what we've got. Actually, one of the questions, so from Chris Meadows, he said you mentioned you went for a detailed planning, I believe. Is that am I correct in saying that? And he says, I have a scheme coming up which will include a mixture of affordable housing and self-build plots. One question we are considering is whether we make a hybrid application or detailed. What made you go for detailed, and how many amendments were required?
Goodness, wow. So this is going to be a challenging question, because it's going back to the year 2000. And I wasn't leading on the planning, but from my recollection of it, and I say we kind of went into it as a community group with a bit of a naive energy and kind of going, oh yeah, we can do this. We can just draw up our plan and put it in. So we didn't actually get any kind of planning. I don't think we had any professional planning support. We just put it in. It was all hand drawn. Having said that, I'm trying to think what's happening at Bridge Farm now. I think at Bridge Farm, they're planning to do it as an outline initially, because like the scheme that you're talking about, and they haven't designed exactly what the houses will be yet, but it's likely that there might be different components. Like there might be some that are self-build, and there might be some that are kind of provided in other ways by a housing association, say. And I know I have heard people talking about hybrid applications, but I'm not sure that that's what's happening in that case. Why? I think,
I suppose if also it'd be interesting, yeah, if Tim or Colin have sort of any advice on that front as well. But sorry, not to interrupt you, Anna.
No, that's fine. I mean, the thing is, I'm not really a planning expert enough to be able to comment on that. So hopefully one of the others will be.
Yeah, do you want to jump in, Colin or Tim, or maybe not feel brave enough?
I just can't work out how to unmute myself. Sorry. So it's a good cue for me to say I'm not a planner, isn't it? And I think my advice to Chris or anyone else who's looking at some sort of hybrid scheme is, and you're going to hate this as advice, and I think the biggest thing it depends on is who is the local planning authority, or what are their policies, and it depends on how those policies are, whether they're very proactive in promoting things, or whether they're sort of normal policies that have been adjusted to acknowledge the fact that self-build exists as a way of construction. So I think it really authority is, and I think I'd invite Chris to have a side chat after the webinar, not immediately after the webinar because I have to rush off, but after the webinar sometime. That helps.
Sounds good. That sounds good. Great.
The only thing I would add, and I'm certainly not a planner, is that there could be something to be learnt from the policies that Teambridge District Council have developed, because they are one of the national pathfinder local authorities in relation to self-build, and have developed some policies. And the thing about planning policies is that there are different interpretations in different areas, and they're not static. So it's possible to learn from good practice in one local authority area and try to encourage local authorities in another area to adopt those, and that might be worth pursuing as well.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good. Okay, so I'll move us on to another question. So Carmen Miron has asked, how close to a village or town is the site required to be for service purposes? I'm not sure I understand the question. Someone enlighten me.
Shall I have a go at that one for you, Hannah?
Yeah, go for it.
I think as the question stands, for service purposes, it's not particularly how close to a village or town, really, as to how close to where those existing services are. So you could be quite a way out of the existing settlement, but if you happen to be right next to the electricity pylons and right next to the road that carries the main drain, well, then you can connect those services relatively easy. So I'd say it's not so much the proximity to the settlement as the proximity to the infrastructure grid that you're trying to connect. And actually, what I'd like to turn it around and say, that was a question about how close to the services you need to be, but actually how close to the settlement do you need to be for planning purposes brings us back to the earlier answer, which is it depends on who your local planning authority is. But in general, this is where we're probably looking at a scheme needing to show that it has an affordable element, if not majority affordable, based on empirical evidence that there's such a need in order to get planning permission at all outside of the normal development envelope. I think I've answered a different question there, but thank you for that opportunity.
Sounds good. Great. Yeah. Did you have any experiences, any difficulties that I suppose central Bristol or suburbs of Bristol is probably slightly closer to the services? So yeah, I don't know if you had any difficulties with those, Anna, or if that was fairly straightforward.
Well, what was interesting there is that we had services that were literally very close, but initially we wanted to make something really sustainable. So we looked at, could we do reed bed, sewage treatment system, could we be off grid? And the advice that we had from everyone was, if you've got the services there, use them. Particularly like the last thing, if you're in the middle of a city, last thing you're going to do is have a reed bed system that fails and it stinks the place out and it puts everyone off eco-build. So yeah, we absolutely did use the services, but that might be different in another location, definitely.
And the other thing I should have said, sorry, is you might be very close to the existing services. In the case of drainage, they might be at capacity. So you need to be close to services that aren't quite at capacity in order to link into them.
That sounds good. Okay, another question from Bernadette Gosling. How easy is it to build on farmland? What are the main hurdles? I'm hoping with others to create an OAP community with small individual units and a centre where we control and manage our future lives. So yeah, I imagine Bridge Farmers has a history as a farm. So are there any particular things that are coming up based on its previous use?
It's actually, interestingly, it's actually classified as open space, which I think is probably a different designation. I mean, it hasn't been technically farmed for quite a while. I think they had horses grazing on it. But we have done some work with the local council who've been very receptive, and they're nominally trying to allocate it as land for community-led housing in the new local plan, which I don't even think is an official designation, but they're putting it down anyway. That's unusual though. So I think in terms of planning, building on farmland, I can't comment on that because I don't have so much experience in the rural areas, but I imagine that's harder. Physically speaking, there are challenges, like it's on a slope. And the biggest challenge is actually getting a road up there, because when you've got very sloping land that you want to build houses on, you've got to get a road up, and the road, when it's on a slope, you've got to do a lot of excavation. It takes up a lot of space, and then you have this massive visual of a great big road. So that we're kind of working through these issues at the moment. How can you be a bit more light touch on the land?
Okay, yeah. It's ongoing for you. Yeah.
And if I could just add to that, I think I'll refer to the earlier question again. That if land is currently agricultural use, and whoever you are, you're going to have an issue with the local planning authority if you want to turn that into effectively residential use. And it will depend on what the local planning authority's policies are. If you're looking at an affordable house or primarily affordable housing scheme that's going to meet very local needs, it's going to be easier to get exceptional planning permission on farmland. But if you're looking at a scheme which is drawing people from all over and don't necessarily have a very local connection, that might be a bit harder. So it really does depend on who the local planning authority is and what their outlook is, and whether they'll see any connection between the people that intend to live on the land and the actual use of that land. The only other thing I wanted to mention, which was just triggered by what Anna just said, that it's also possible to build on slopes. You're right, the difficulty with gradients is going to be all the excavation because you need to have a road, but there are other construction methods, particularly piling with undercrofts, which mean you can work on almost any gradient. You can do that in a timber form as well as in other materials, so you can still do that in a ecologically friendly way.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so we've had a nice little mention from Joanne Kelly as well, saying, is it worth mentioning the National Self-Build Centre in Swindon can recommend their events for free lectures, materials advice and consultants available to answer any questions as well as a good general place to go for advice. Thanks, Joanne. So Julian's asked, Julian Peacock, why was affordable housing needed when the whole site is affordable? I'm not sure if I need that to be expanded on as well. If
on this site here,
looks like that's mentioned. Yeah,
it was affordable when we first built it, but then of course when someone wants to sell their house, what happens? It goes on the market, and so a house sold a couple of years ago for 600,000. Not really affordable.
Missing the
market prices. Yeah. If we'd known about community land trusts, and which we didn't in 2000 because it wasn't well known, we might have tried to set something up, but we didn't. So it's been a learning process since then.
I think that brings us back to Tim's earlier intervention, that one of the advantages of a community land trust, or similar community land trust, do some other form of asset lock, is to try to retain that affordability in perpetuity. But go back to being a jaded old housing professional, we tend to use the word affordable in housing speak. It means a very specific thing, and it tends to be housing that in other people's more plain English is submarket. So something which is latest government expectations, no more than 80% of what the market rate might be for occupation of that property. If it's rented, a rent of no more than 80% of the market rent. If it's for sale at purchase prices discounted by at least 20%, although they're now talking about discounting 30%. I think that what Anna's mentioned demonstrates that that's fine on day one. In all cases, we need to have a financial model that works into the future. So not only do we need to hold the land in trust in perpetuity, but we also need to make sure that we don't trap people in buildings that they then can't sell on to somebody else who is able to afford it at some point in the future. So I think there are several levels to this word affordability, and it's something that needs quite a lot of thought at the outset.
I think it might be, this is a plug for next week, but next week the theme is community land trusts, and I think, because we don't really have time to go into it now, but it is worth saying that if people are interested, there are a couple of schemes. One is Broadhempston in Devon. So that was a group self-build where everybody built each other's houses. There were 6 families who built each other's houses. They actually own the freehold, but the community land trust that's involved have a covenant on the site. And so there's a resale covenant. So when they sell, the purchase price for the new owner is 80% of market value. Actually, that doesn't really make it affordable. Anyway, that's another issue. There's another one called St Minver in Cornwall. St Minver Community Land Trust, they have a resale, it's a sort of discounted market sale approach, and that's 50% of market value. So that's something that we could explore next week. You know, that you can play around with these covenants that ensure a discount on the market sale. There's also some initiatives where a community land trust is then leasing to a self-build cooperative, or a cooperative that does self-build, and that's another way of finding a way to sort of ensure affordability in perpetuity. So, as I say, it's quite complicated, but it could be something that we explore a bit further next week when we talk about community land trusts.
Definitely. Nice one. Well, so what I've done is I think we can end on one really quick final question. Maybe it won't feel that quick, but maybe some closing thoughts. And also in the meantime, if everybody would like to go and have a look at the little link that I've posted in the chat box for the feedback form, we'd be so grateful if you would just give us a couple of minutes to fill that in. It just means that we can carry on delivering sort of the help that's most appropriate at the moment, and yeah, directs what we do in the future. So where should one start with the project, site or the group? I know we've spoken about that briefly already, but yeah, any closing thoughts on that?
And I'm not sure it's a choice that you can make. It kind of it happens one way or the other. I think with our project, more or less both the projects, the Ashley Vale and the Bridge Farm, the site came up, and then the kind of group went, oh, here's an opportunity, let's work with that, and that's worked really well. But you don't always have that choice. So yeah, I think it's probably a bit more ideal, but I'd like to hear other people's thoughts.
Yeah, Colin, I suppose as the community housing advisor, and you've got people who come to you and say, do I need to know about a site first? What would you say?
Well, I'd say there is no right answer. I'd say, as some of you know, there's an emerging model of community-led housing that's been brought out nationally, where we try to talk about it in 5 clear stages. And the first of those stages is group, and the second is and then plan, and then build, and then live. And in an ideal world, I guess you'd start with group, and you'd start with who is it you want to house, why do you want to house them, and under sort of what conditions and what sort of legal structure would be. And then when you've established that, you go and look for a site that would be suitable. And I guess that is the route that's been followed by a lot of community land trusts, particularly in rural areas. But real life isn't like that, and sometimes the site comes first. And we've heard that today, and we've got other examples where a site has been bequeathed to a group, and so the groups had to form in order to do whatever it was that the benefactor thought they might be doing on the land that they're doing. So I think the strict answer is there isn't a right answer. There's a nice textbook model, and in the textbook model you start with group. But if people want advice, we'll jump in and try and give advice at whatever stage they think they're at.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I think that's a good place to end. Anna, thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, really wonderful to hear about all you've been up to, and best of luck as well with Bridge Farm. We'll be following and supporting, and and stealing ideas. That's brilliant. Yeah, and thank you for joining us, Tim and Colin, as well. That's great. Nice one. All right then, everybody, we'll see you next week if you're joining us for Community Land Trusts. And otherwise, feel free to get in touch anytime, and I'll be sending out a follow-up email with resources as well. Great. All right. Have a great afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.